fun friends and wellness warriors. We got a great show today with Dr. Stephen Hussey over here. He just wrote an amazing book called The Heart, Surprising Insights into the Evolutionary Origins of Heart Disease and Why It Matters. And as our number one killer, this is a big topic and there's a lot that we can do about it, a lot of misconceptions around this topic. And so I just got to dive into his book and I'm thoroughly impressed. So we're excited to have you, Dr. Hussey. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah. And we do 2 fun questions just for everybody who ever comes on the show, just to get a little personal flavor. So the first is just going to be, what did you eat for breakfast?
I didn't have anything for breakfast. I usually fast. I guess you could say I had some coffee, but with no cream or anything, just black coffee.
Okay.
So yeah, but that's not going to break my fast. So yeah.
No. Is this an everyday kind of fasting, or are you fasting?
Yeah, days where I'm early in the clinic. Yeah, that's what I do. So that's 4 out of the 5 days I'm in the clinic week. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Second question, and this is maybe going to go a direction, that I would expect, but what was one of the gifts of the pandemic for you?
I think a realization that, because in my line of work, I often get the argument that people aren't going to change. I'm about changing lifestyle. I'm about changing health habits and that kind of stuff to achieve higher levels of health and a healthier planet overall. I think that if anything, the pandemic proved that if you create enough motivation in one way or another, people do change their behavior. And I think that that's a positive we could take from that, is that if we give the right messaging and if we keep spreading a good message for health, that people will change their behavior. We just have to get it out there.
Beautiful. Yeah. I felt like in the beginning of when I'm trying to get this message out, we're kind of like in this echo chamber where the people in the wellness space, they get it, they accept it. But now I feel like we're infiltrating the mainstream and there's a lot more ears around that. So I love that you said that. Now, like I said, you've been on the podcast before. We talked about the evolutionary origins of disease and kind of the paleo lifestyle. This book is very different and very deeply personal. So can you talk about your story, why you felt compelled to write this book, and even talk about your experience in the hospital? I found it very interesting that someone with so much knowledge was kind of cast aside and you weren't taken as seriously as I think you should have been. So give us your story. Why did this book matter to you?
So, I've struggled with health issues for a lot of my life. When I was a kid, I had a lot of inflammatory issues, asthma, allergies, used to break out in chronic hives. And I ultimately ended up with autoimmune type 1 diabetes from all that inflammation. And my body doesn't make insulin. And so that heavily predisposes me to heart disease. As I found out throughout my upbringing and relying on Western medicine, that was just always what I was told. And so I had this interest in heart disease that, throughout my educations, my ears always perked up when there was something about heart disease, and I'm always doing my own research. I found that a lot of what I'd been told about heart disease was wrong. And there was a lot of things about the heart that I felt were wrong, or that I was discovering was wrong based on this information I was looking into. And so, for like probably 10 to 12 years, I had just been accumulating this information about the heart in my head and in books and things, and that I had in research articles. And eventually I just started sharing it on social media and people liked it. And so I figured, well, I'll write it all down in a book. And because I already written my first book, The Health Evolution. So I was like, well, I'll do one about the heart. And so, yeah, that's what we have today. We have Understanding the Heart. And so about, I guess it was probably like 2 months before I had finished writing the book and was going to hopefully get it out there and release it. I had a heart attack. Straight up, there's no other way to say it. I had a heart attack. Yeah. And it was an interesting heart attack in that, because in my book, I describe heart attacks that have no blockage and how that is a possibility and how it's more common than we think. That's not the type that I had. I definitely had a clot formation. But when they went in and placed the stent, they noticed that there was little to no atherosclerosis anywhere. There was just a giant clot that formed in my left anterior descending artery. And so, I have my, my explanation or reasons as to why I think that happened. which we can get into if we want. But it was, I was laying in the hospital in the cardiac ICU, realizing that I almost just lost my life. And I was, it was a very like humbling moment for me. I felt very, I don't know. I felt very, obviously sad, but it's just I felt like there's no way I could release this book. Like, who would listen to me now?
Oh, yeah.
Like, and just a lot of doubt in my mind at that time. But then, I spent about 3 days in the hospital, which is not a lot of time after someone's usually had a heart attack. I recovered very well, and I continue to recover very well. But my experience in those 3 days, I kind of knew what to expect from Western medicine because I'm in this field, but I'd never experienced it firsthand. And based on what I would call shortcomings that I saw in the hospital and how I was treated and how it was, like you say, cast aside as far as like my opinions. And I was really just trying to open up conversation about, what I was going to do going forward and what my options were. And there was really no interest in that. And a lot of the advice, quote unquote, advice that I got while I was in the hospital, I know based on what I read is completely wrong. And so obviously I didn't follow that advice, but it was really the most disturbing thing was just the shutdown of conversation that happened about my health, not necessarily someone else's or, or like another patient that they had. So like, it was my health and they
You're
just
not
didn't want to
offering
talk about
unsolicited advice.
Yeah, right. And it was just, every time a new doctor came in or a new resident came in, it was always like, oh, we heard about that you don't want to take your medication, so we're not even going to talk about that. It was that kind of information. I was like, okay, well, and then every time I'd bring something up or want to talk about something, it was, I don't know anything about that, so I'm not going to comment on that, which I guess I can respect. If they don't know anything about it, then they shouldn't comment on it. But yeah, it was just, so those 3 days in the hospital made me realize that, despite me having a heart attack, none of the information I have in the book, I would change. I think that I was under a very high amount of stress during that time. And I think that there was kind of this alignment of the planets that happened for me, and it caused this clot. And there was some factors that I think contributed to that. But it doesn't change any of my opinions in the book. And I thought about this for a while. And then the experience I had in the hospital made me realize that I have to get this information out there, because there's going to be people who are going to be facing the same situation as me, or are trying to prevent that situation. And I need to share that. And so I went forward with it, and then it got picked up by a publisher, and now it's out. So
I'm so proud that you did. Yeah, there's this kind of weird pressure on people who talk about health for a living that they're not supposed to have any sort of health issues. But often that's why we come into this space. And I remember even recently I went to the dentist. Like, I totally bought into the Weston A. Price thing. I eat an ancestral diet. I can't have any dental issues. Turns out I do. And I know that exactly how you felt. I was like, oh my gosh, like I am such a fraud. But it's like, no, sometimes we have blind spots or further lessons that we need to learn, and our experience is just there to guide us. And it's how we react to that experience that determines, whether we shrink away and lose our confidence, or whether we press forward, learn more, and help have a bigger impact. So I'm so glad this book is out. And you talked about it. They wanted to put you on 11 medications. They didn't control your insulin between meals. I want to ask you, you talk a lot about the metabolic theory of, heart disease and why it can happen in the absence of clots. You had a clot. Why did you have a clot? What's your theory?
Yeah. So, being type 1 diabetic predisposed me. So I talk about 3 imbalances in my book, and those are poor metabolic health, inflammation, oxidative stress, and imbalance in the autonomic nervous system. And I talk about studies in the book that show that as a type 1 diabetic, I am more likely to suffer those imbalances. I work really hard not to, but I am more predisposed. So I think that, 26 years now of being type 1 diabetic, and probably half of those not the most well controlled because I was younger and didn't really understand the consequences. I think that was a big contributing factor, but also this was the year, it was COVID year. And there was a lot of stressful things happening around that time. And I'm not to say that I obviously wasn't the only one undergoing stress, but I never really bought into a lot of the things that were going on during that time, like the election and social injustice. Like I never really paid too much attention to the news and stuff like that. But for some reason, since COVID was health related, I got sucked in because health is my thing, and so lots of those things were stressing me out. And then um, I I also received some very very stressful news about two days before the heart attack happened,
Mm.
and so I think that I was in this very inflamed state, probably the most psychological stress I've ever been under. And I've done some research, and this lots of people may not be in the health space, may not be a fan of me saying this, but I've done some research and I've found that there's some evidence. There's actually 2 or 3 studies that show that very intense exercise in a state of inflammation can trigger clots
Mm.
um, in a big way. Actually, it's pretty convincing research, and that those were the workouts that I was doing at that time. And I did one literally 45 minutes before I had a heart attack. I did
Whoa.
a very intense workout where, basically I sprint up a hill to exhaustion, drop down and do push-ups till I can't do anymore, then do lunges till I can't do anymore. Like it was just that kind of workout.
Wow.
And then I came in and took a very hot shower and then had a heart attack. And I don't think that the average person doing that type of workout is at risk, but with type 1 diabetes and being under the amount of stress I was under, I think that may have predisposed that stuff to happen, and a clot formed, and that's what they found, just this clot. Because I had a CAC score done 6 months prior to this, and it was 0. There's literally no atherosclerosis in my coronary arteries, or no calcified atherosclerosis, anyways. And so yeah, I think that's my theory as to why this happened.
Wow, that's fascinating. Now, this is usually a rude question, but how old are you? Like, you're
I'm
doing those kinds of
35.
workouts. Okay. So yes, a young man, type 1 diabetic, and these intense workouts. Now, the interesting thing is, I know we're going to get into this. You track something called HRV, right? I'm
Mhm.
sure you do, because you talk about in your book, I track. Do you notice that those intense workouts were kind of reducing that score? Were you recovered when you were doing this or not?
That's it. That's a good question. I don't notice that, like, generally I didn't notice that those types of workouts would reduce them.
Okay.
Generally I noticed it would stay pretty level. My HRV would stay what it usually is. But no, I never really noticed that, but I can't say that I remember what it was when I got that news.
Mm,
You know,
yeah.
I got that
Yeah.
news Sunday night, and Tuesday morning is when I had the heart attack. So, um, yeah, I wasn't thinking about that. I can't say that I know what it was those days between when I got that news and had the heart attack.
Yeah.
I was so consumed by that news. So
Of course, yeah. And Dr. Cohen has been on our podcast and talked about that autonomic balance. That's kind of his main theory, that it is about this inability of the parasympathetic, or our rest and digest, relax, to come in and turn off that stress response. That
mhm.
is probably the primary factor in heart disease. And you are maybe an example of that. So
Yeah.
thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing that. And I want to kind of tease this out, because we have this misconception that it's very cut and dry. We get elevated levels of cholesterol in the blood because we're eating too much saturated fat, and then that kind of accumulates and gets into the artery wall and creates this plaque, and then we have heart attacks. But it's just not so well understood. So can you tell us some of the biggest misconceptions around heart disease? And also, maybe even before you do that, are rates of heart disease getting better since we've been diligently reducing cholesterol and animal products and saturated fat? Are we getting healthier?
Yeah, short answer to that is no. Heart disease. There was a time, like I talk about in the book. I think it was
Yep.
like early
I think
'90s
it
or
was
something like that, where it leveled
2008.
out.
Yeah, it was like 2008 or maybe
Yeah,
2008,
up
something
until
like
that time, it was like leveled out, but then it started climbing again. So yeah, so there was a time where it leveled out, but it never went down necessarily, to at least any significant amount. So no, it's not getting better. So despite all these, fancy procedures, and the newest medications, and more people taking medications, yeah, heart disease is getting worse. So yeah, we're doing something wrong, right? Because you'd expect to see some sort of result if you look at the statistics, people are eating less of the foods they're being recommended to eat less of. They are doing that. because they can always chalk it up to, oh, people just aren't following our advice. Well, no, people are,
Yeah.
and it's still getting worse, right? So obviously we need a different approach. But yeah, so yeah, throughout my own individual research and just curiosity, really, I found a lot of things, like this whole theory that cholesterol causes heart disease, and this is a very commonly one that's talked about, is false, I think, or largely false. Cholesterol plays a role, but it is not the driving factor. And we need to look at it in context of many other things when we're trying to assess what does cause heart disease, or atherosclerosis specifically, I guess. But also there's things like that the heart is the main mover of blood in the body. That is also, I believe, to be false. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that that's the case, that the heart is there for very different reasons than to be forcefully pumping blood throughout the body. The other misconception we've kind of already touched on is that all heart attacks are caused by a clot or blockage that forms in an artery and blocks flow of blood somewhere. And that's not always the case, because there are plenty of examples where they go in, they try and find a clot and there's not one, but there's still tissue death. So why does that happen? And I've kind of labeled these metabolic heart attacks, where it happens because of a shift in metabolism within heart tissue due to very, very specific circumstances that happen. And then the other one is not really necessarily a myth or anything, but it's just interesting to me, is that for some reason, the heart seems to be protected against cancer. And to a certain extent, it's very rare to get heart cancer. It does exist, but it's very rare to have a primary tumor that starts in the heart. And it's even rare to get metastasis to the heart, even though that does happen. But most of the time we get heart cancer is because it came from somewhere else first. So the heart tissue, very rarely gets cancer or originates with cancer there. So all that stuff is pretty interesting. And that's, the second part of my book covers a lot of those things. So yeah, we can go off in any direction from those.
Yeah, I kind of want to know, gosh, okay, so the cholesterol, major organizations and kind of mainstream, that's kind of getting out there, that is acknowledged. Even eating dietary cholesterol doesn't even always raise levels of blood cholesterol. And that also, even when you reduce cholesterol, like they do in a lot of the trials, like the Rose trial where they used corn oil, you can reduce cholesterol, but not reduce your risk of death, right? And there have since been several reanalyses done by Ramsden of the Minnesota coronary trial, and just to suggest, hey, all this time when we thought reducing cholesterol was going to prevent deaths, we found out it doesn't. Reevaluation of data shows us that's not true. Now, the second one is really interesting, because you're saying that the heart is not actually moving all of the blood everywhere in your body. So I want you to expand on that a little bit. What is actually going on there to move the blood?
Yeah. So to talk about this, we have to preface it with this talk about water. So water is this unique substance, this unique liquid that can hold energy. And so it can absorb different forms or different wavelengths of energy from the environment. But the most absorbed is infrared light at the 3000 nanometer wavelength. And this is all work coming from Gerald Pollack's lab in University of Washington, which he has some amazing books out there if people want to look into that. But so when water holds energy sufficiently, and it gets next to a surface that's water loving, a hydrophilic surface, it actually starts to structure itself. And so this water is not solid, not liquid, not gas. It's kind of between solid and liquid. It's kind of in this gel state. I mean, they've called it fourth phase water. It's the fourth phase, or they call it structured water, or exclusion zone water. There's lots of different names for it. And so when this happens, so there's lots of different hydrophilic surfaces in nature, and the lining of our arteries, and the arteries of different animals is one of them. And so our blood is more or less half water. And so if the water in our blood is sufficiently energized, when it gets next to this hydrophilic surface that is the artery, it actually structures itself into this gel-like substance that kind of lines the arteries. And when that happens, because of the way it forms, because of the way it cleaves off a hydrogen molecule from the water, it actually creates an energy gradient, because there's a very negative electronegative space next to a very electropositive space in the lumen of the artery, and that creates an energy gradient that actually creates blood flow. And they've done this over and over again in experiments in Dr. Pollack's lab, and they've actually proven it in chick embryos. They've actually, when they euthanize the chick, the blood continues to flow in those arteries despite no beating heart. And if they put radiant energy into the system, it continues to flow. So this does happen. It's a real thing. And also, like, you know, one question I like to ask, and I know Dr. Cowan has asked it too, is it's like, how does water get from the roots of trees up to the leaves? You know, there's no pump there that we think of, you know, so the same mechanism is at play, this energy gradient that creates flow. And it will continue to flow in one direction indefinitely as long as there's radiant energy put into the system. And so that's how the majority of blood is moving. It's moving on its own. And so then, you know, we have this contracting heart that's there. And so it's easy to think, oh yeah, the contraction is pumping and it's moving blood, and it is moving blood a little bit, but really no more force is created than to just kind of move the blood through the heart itself. There's no way it could create enough force to move the blood all the way down, you know, to the exchange of the tissues and then back up through the veins. Like, it just couldn't do that. And there are other things that help with that flow, like contraction of muscle, and there's one-way valves in the veins and things like that. But there's still no way, unless there was some other mechanism that was moving blood through the body, there's no way the heart could do that on its own. And a matter of fact, if it's forced to do more of that on its own, I think that's what contributes to heart failure, because the heart is forced to be more of a pump than it actually is. And that puts more pressure into it. And then we get that expansion of the heart, which is what we see in heart failure. We get the heart swells up more like a basketball rather than a football shaped type thing. And so, yeah, so why is the heart there then? If there's other things moving the blood, and like I said, you know, the heart does do a little bit of pumping, just enough to get the blood through the heart itself. But another thing that energizes blood is actually vortexing it or swirling it, you know, swishing it around in the presence of oxygen. And so this energizes the blood so that when it gets next to a hydrophilic surface, it can structure itself and create that energy gradient. And so when we look at how the heart muscle is oriented, it's oriented in a spiral-like fashion. And actually, the heart is one big long band of muscle that's actually wrapped up on itself. And so when it contracts, it does this twisting like motion, and oxygen is always present in the blood, even if it's coming from the veins, coming back to the heart, there's still oxygen present. It's less oxygen than in the arterial blood after it goes to the lungs, but there's still oxygen present. So the heart is more or less a vortex. It's vortexing in multiple places as the blood moves through the heart. It's vortexing the blood to energize it, so that to keep it energized, so that when it gets to the arteries, it can do that. And then, so in a way, you know, the heart is responsible for the movement of blood because it's vortexing things, but just not in the pressure propulsion pump type way that we're thinking. And since, you know, a pressure propulsion pump is something that would take standing water from somewhere and suck it in and then forcefully pump it somewhere else. And that's not what the heart's doing. The blood is already flowing, and the heart's kind of placed in the middle of it. And so that, to me, that's more like a hydraulic ram, which I didn't know what that was when I first heard that term. So people can go,
tell us what that is.
So a hydraulic ram is just kind of this engineering device that's put together so that if water is flowing into something, it can kind of take it and create pressure in other ways and forcefully move it somewhere else. So like if water is flowing into one chamber, that chamber fills up and then it opens up a one-way valve because of the pressure that's created there, and it flows out of that valve into somewhere else. And then when pressure builds up, then it pushes back and it closes the valve.
So it's like a pressure manager.
Right.
And
that's what the heart is doing. It's kind of two hydraulic rams put together because there's the right side and the left side of it. So that's kind of how it's working. It operates more like hydraulic ram, not exactly like one, but more like one. But then the other reason the heart is there is that to maintain pressure in the system, because if I was to like go for a run or something, like most of the blood, like my tissues would demand blood because they need, you know, energy and they need oxygen and all that stuff. And so all the blood rushes over to the arterial side to deliver it to tissues. And if the heart wasn't there, actually slowing down the flow of blood, it would all go to the arterial side and the venous side would collapse, which would result in death. So the heart is placed in the middle, like where it is, to maintain pressure in the systems. And there's actually a lot of research in endurance athletes, especially soccer players, that show this, like when in doing exercise like this, that the heart actually slows down the flow of blood to maintain the pressure in the two systems, which is not what we think. We think, oh, the heart's beating faster because it's delivering more blood to the tissues, and that's not the case. It's beating faster to catch up with the demand of blood flowing, but it still moves slower through the heart. And like the people we've heard about hearts getting bigger in endurance athletes because it's pumping a lot more, but it's not really pumping. It's getting bigger because it's getting stronger at resisting the flow. So the muscles have to be stronger to resist that flow, that hard flow. And so really fascinating, kind of turns things on its head a little bit.
Is this kind of accepted? Or
not necessarily, no.
People don't
I mean,
really know that.
It's accepted that hearts do get bigger and stronger in endurance athletes.
Yeah.
But the reason why is not necessarily accepted. They think it's because the hearts are working harder because they're pumping more forcefully all the time. When in reality, the heart's working harder to maintain pressure in the system because these people are delivering so much blood to their tissues in the arterial side that the heart has to work hard to keep the venous side under pressure.
Now, is this the result of like, there is this, and we can definitely relate to this with this cholesterol narrative, this cholesterol saturated fat narrative. It is so hard to break out of because that's just what everyone says. And when you don't believe that, you're kind of a quack. So is it because the research people aren't just aware of it, or is it because they straight up don't accept that viewpoint?
It's mainly because I think they're not aware of it.
Okay.
I mean, I think about, like, because I went through, chiropractic school, which is more or less just like medical school as far as what we learn, and like basic science is exactly the same. And like, you learn the heart as a pump.
Yeah.
Why would you question it? Why would you ever question it? You listen to your teachers, they tell you what it is. And like, why would you ever think otherwise? And then you're so busy that why would you ever, like, unless you're a researcher, and you go into that field and you actually really just question things and you test things out, like, you're never really going to come across that,
Yeah.
And you're definitely not going to come across it within Western medicine, because as far as like heart failure goes, if you think of the heart as this pressure propulsion pump and it's failing, it's not doing its job, quote unquote, its job, it's the heart's fault. Something's wrong with the heart, right? That's the view you would take, right? But if you recognize that the heart's job is not to forcefully pump blood around the body, then heart failure is not a problem with the heart. I mean, yes, there can be deficiencies in metabolism that can contribute to it, like not being metabolically flexible or something in heart tissue that can contribute to heart failure because it's just not as efficient. But the real issue is the blood is not moving around the body like it should be, and the heart is forced to do something it's not really designed to do. And so if you think about it that way, then heart failure takes a whole new meaning, and what we should do for people with heart failure takes a whole new meaning as well.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you for hanging in with us in that, it's like somewhat nerdy section. I mean, I'll draw, hydraulic-gram and all of that, but it is important, like you said, when we get to the solutions. And before we get there, I just want to talk about one other thing, which I found really fascinating. Now, when it comes to like serum cholesterol, I think it was like one study, 75% of the people who had a heart attack had within range levels of cholesterol. So we kind of have knocked down that. We know that that is not necessarily predictive, but you also talked about blockages and atherosclerosis and some really interesting research about how that's not as certain either. And we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but can you go into that research? Because I just think it's very, very important for people to understand.
Yeah. So in the book, I talk about like how a heart attack can happen without a blockage. And one of the things that led me to trying to figure this out was this research by a guy named Giorgio Beraldi, who is an Italian scientist who worked in the United States and Canada throughout his career. But he was pretty convinced that heart attacks could happen without a blockage, and he pretty much proved it. And one of the most fascinating things he did was he started making these plastic casts of the heart, of the arterial system of the heart. So he would pump the arteries of a heart full of like this neoprene or plastic material, and then let it harden. And then he would dissolve away the tissue, and he had this cast of the heart. Like if you've ever been to those Body World exhibits, they do that a lot with those, And so what he found was that pretty much anywhere there was a 70% stenosis or higher, that the body had built this extensive network of collaterals around it. Okay. And so
what does that mean? That there's other ways for the blood to actually get to and from?
Right. Yeah. So the body had built new arteries from before the clot happened to go around to the other side and bypass this collateral, right? Or this blockage or this stenosis. And so it's pretty fascinating. And that was like literally 100% of the time. Anywhere there was a 70%. It wasn't like, oh, just sometimes, it was all the time. The body had found a way, so to speak. And so that's really interesting, because then to me, it kind of tells me why, when we look at the research of placing elective stents, like a stent in my situation, life-saving, right?
Yeah.
But a stent where someone just has a stenosis and they go and they do an angiogram, they say, oh, let's place a stent here. Like the elective ones, in non-emergent situations, they haven't really been shown to prolong life or prevent heart attacks, right? And same with bypass surgeries. They haven't really been shown, like when we look at the long-term data in these people who have them or don't, it doesn't really prevent heart attacks and it doesn't really extend their life. Why? Because the body's already built the system that's bypassed the stenosis, right? We don't, if we bypass it again or we open it back up, it doesn't really help. The body's already taking care of it. That's, at least that's my suggestion. That's my suggestion as to why those procedures haven't really led to good results. So pretty fascinating stuff. But then it begs the question of why does a heart attack happen if the blockage is taken care of, So like in a situation where, so a clot can happen, like if there's atherosclerosis and there's stenosis of an artery and pressure can build up, whether it's under stress or something like that, a piece of that can break off. And that leads to a clot formation, like the body has a clotting response, and that leads to clot formation. But there are plenty of examples of where that doesn't happen, or where, there was stenosis in a coronary artery, but it was anywhere near where the heart attack happened. It was in a different part of the heart, different tissue died. And so that to me is a result of three things, poor metabolic health, when you can't burn fats or go back and forth from burning fats and glucose readily, and you're not making many ketones. If you have inflammation and oxidative stress, that leads to a depletion of nitric oxide in the body, and an imbalance in the autonomic nervous system that can send us into a stress response that unfortunately gives the heart signals to switch its fuel source to primarily glucose, which can cause bad things. Like you can imagine, like when you go for a run, that's like lactic acid builds up in your muscle and it starts to burn, right? To me, that's angina. It's not necessarily restriction of blood flow to an area. It's a shift in metabolism in the heart tissue. But when that happens, lactic acid builds up and we get pressure buildup and we get a negative pressure in the heart tissue, and blood just can't get to it. Even if blood's flowing just fine, there's no stenosis, there's no blockage, it can't get to it, and that creates tissue death. And that can be a cause of heart attacks too. And it all comes down to, like I said, those three imbalances that can kind of set us up for that situation to happen.
Okay, cool. And now you've mentioned those three twice, and I think that is beautiful, because we're going to expand on them a little bit, and then we're going to get to, okay, so what should I be eating? What should I be taking supplement? What should I be doing lifestyle wise? That's going to be coming right around the corner. But I want you to expand on these just briefly, layperson's terms. So why does this imbalance, or why does this insulin resistant piece matter for the heart specifically? And
so the heart
resistance, just so you know, is long-term blood sugar dysregulation, often attributable to high carbohydrate consumption. Okay.
Yeah. And vegetable oil consumption.
Yes.
That's a big one too. Yeah. So why is it important to the heart? The heart, and most organs, but there's a lot of research showing that the heart prefers fatty acids and ketones for fuel. Yes. Right. And even in the presence of glucose, there's studies that show that when they put glucose in, or there was glucose around, when they put ketones in, the heart went for the ketones. And so it prefers this because it's a more efficient energy source. We get way more ATP production when we burn ketones and fatty acids than we do from burning glucose. And the heart is a very metabolically active organ because it's always contracting. It literally never stops. And so, so it needs this more efficient energy source. That's why it has this preference, which is interesting because, people who go on like ketogenic diets, they have to kind of restrict carbohydrates, restrict glucose in order to get their body to burn more of the fats and ketones, whereas the heart, even in the presence of glucose, is like, now we want the ketones. So it's very important to stay metabolically healthy. But like I mentioned, there is an instance where if we get into the stress response, that it can trigger the body to not be metabolically flexible and go straight to burning glucose, because that's what happens in muscle. Right. That's what happens in our skeletal muscle. It relies on those glycogen stores, the glucose storage. When we start working out, when we start doing something intense, right, it goes to those glycogen stores and that creates lactic acid. We get muscle burn. So it's really important in the heart to stay metabolically flexible. But I don't think evolution was accounting for this modern day stress that could force it into a different route, a different fuel source.
Beautiful. So you're saying, we need to stay metabolically healthy. That means our blood sugar needs to be in a great range. We're going to talk about how that happens in a second, but also that even if you are metabolically healthy and you have unaddressed stress, this can still kick that heart into using the glucose. This creates like kind of an acidic environment, and then calcium isn't used as efficiently, and then that can lead to heart issues. So that's beautiful. Those are the two: metabolically healthy, addressing stress. We're going to get to how to do that in a second. The last piece was I found really fascinating too, is when we're burning energy, glucose, fat, protein, we're always creating byproducts, right? Free radicals as a byproduct. And when we burn carbohydrates, we make more of them. So tell us, what does oxidative stress and inflammation, that middle piece, what does that have to do with the heart specifically? Where does it come from? And what can we do about it?
Yeah. So it seems that specifically to the heart, that when we get the signal of our autonomic nervous system to heart tissue, the sympathetic, parasympathetic signals are supposed to be in balance. Like if we get a surge in sympathetic, like a stressful response, then the non-stress response is always going to be there to balance it out. It may not be as much of a surge, but it's always there to balance it out. Well, it turns out with heart tissue, it needs the parasympathetic, the non-stress signal needs nitric oxide in order to enter the heart cells and give it that signal. It needs nitric oxide. And unfortunately, if we're in a very inflamed or oxidative stress state, that depletes nitric oxide. It prevents it from giving that signal. And so we don't get the signal to the balance signal. We get only the stress signal, and the non-stress signal doesn't come to balance it out. And so that is a situation that, like I said, can create this surge of adrenaline to the heart, this stressful response in the heart that forces it to say, okay, we need glucose, we need energy really fast, let's burn glucose only, and that's the signal that it gets. And that's problematic if it happens in an acute situation.
Beautiful. So you're saying metabolic health, inflammation, oxidative stress, they matter, but stress matters the most because it can absolutely hijack both processes if left unaddressed. Okay, I love that. So let's get to the stuff. Like, what are we going to do to stay metabolically healthy? What does your diet look like now that you basically probably have this dialed in more than anyone, given your recent experience. So what are you eating? And what do you think are the major culprits in this metabolic derangement that most of us, I think like 7 out of 8 of us are experiencing today?
Yeah. So I eat pretty low carb, and I don't think that necessarily everybody has to achieve metabolic health. I don't think you need to be eating tons of carbs, and definitely not processed carbohydrates, but like, a sweet potato or some berries or something, in moderation, it's not going to derail your metabolic health if you're metabolically healthy already. But I don't eat very many carbohydrates because I'm type 1 diabetic and I'm trying to be a pancreas, and carbohydrates are just make things harder for me to control blood sugar. So I'm pretty low carb.
Like, what is define that for us? Because we can wear GMs, and I highly recommend we do that. Continuous glucose monitors, find your sweet spot, your foods, but where are you living?
Yeah. So I don't eat breakfast, and then, for lunch, I'll always have some variation of some sort of meat, whether it's ground beef or steak or pork or something like that. I do a lot of eggs, and then some vegetables mixed in there. But my diet is centered around animal foods. And those are the most bang for your buck kind of nutrients there. And I also do some dairy, but I do like raw A2 dairy. I'm pretty diligent about that. And I'll have like the same variations of things for dinner. I'll just have like some meat, and mostly meat, or an eggs or something like that, or yogurt, and then some vegetables sprinkled in on that. That's pretty much my go-to. It doesn't really get much more varied than that. And that's just what I do.
Yeah. And if anyone's listening and like, oh my gosh, meat, they're eating meat for your heart, that's crazy, just say, if you look historically, meat was one of the reasons we became human, one of the reasons we actually developed the brain, our, kind of rich social life. But also in the 1900s, when heart attack rates started to rise, there was actually a decrease in our meat consumption right before that, right? And heart disease rates really started to kind of come, and our health really started to go off the rails when we started following our dietary recommendations that were introduced in 1977. So I just want to say that, because if you're new to this podcast and you're thinking meat is definitively a cause of heart issues. There is a lot of evidence to the contrary. Anyway, what about vegetable oils?
Yeah.
Talk about that piece. Are you?
Well, it's funny that you
oils?
say that just after you said, like, when meat consumption went down, guess what went up? Vegetable
Yes,
oils. Like in
exactly.
early 1900s, 19 teens. That's when they started figuring out that this thing that they developed to lubricate engines could also be put into food.
Crisco, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so it started becoming pretty pervasive in the food supply. And yeah, by 1930s, 1940s, we had rising rates of heart disease. And everybody was freaking out about why. People didn't understand why. And then President Eisenhower had a heart attack, and it was all over the news and everything. And yeah, so it's interesting that, we stopped eating a certain type of fat and a certain type of food and started eating another.
A
And that,
novel one that we have
yeah.
never eaten in history. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Never. And matter of fact, in the early 1900s, the field of cardiology was not really a thing. There was a few cardiologists, people who were like interested in the heart, but it wasn't like this massive field that it is today. There was just very few medical doctors that took interest in cardiology, or because the heart disease was not around, it just wasn't a thing.
And we
And
were
all of a sudden
eating
it
meat.
became.
Yeah, and we were eating meat for 2.5 million years
Yeah.
prior to that.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
Yeah, and sometimes, and in some cases, our diet was almost entirely animals. And like Neanderthals and early modern humans. It seems like the evidence points to the fact that it was almost entirely animals. So yeah, it's interesting that people haven't made that observation. But it's driven by a lot of money and bad research and stuff like that. And so it's understandable how the idea got there, but we just need to get away from it, because the main foods that we increase that are driving this are the vegetable oils, like we talked about, which means like the corn, canola, soy, safflower, those types of oils,
Sunflower.
soy, yeah, all those things, all those oils, and then grains, processed grains, I say, but that means all grains, because all grains are processed pretty much in order to eat them. I would say those foods are not really serving us. And then sugars, especially added sugars, high fructose corn syrups and things like that. Like, these are the three foods, three categories of foods that are driving most of heart disease, but pretty much all disease, I think. And those are the foods that we've increased a lot of since 1930s and 40s. And that's when we're seeing rates of disease, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, all these things rising. But food is not the only thing either. And that's one of my main goals in the book, is to talk about how food is not it's a big part of it, but it's not the only thing driving heart disease. There's many other things.
Yes, and we're going to get into those. I wanted to say, though, that I found this fascinating. I can't remember the doctor whose lecture I was watching. And I know when you look at epidemiological data, vegetable oils high in polyunsaturated fatty acids appear to be helpful, right? Observational data. But then this guy noted that even our rate of carbohydrate consumption, and even in countries who eat a lot of carbohydrates, when they don't also eat a lot of vegetable oils, this doesn't happen, and that our rates of vegetable oils have been increasing so much more dramatically than our rates of carbohydrate consumption when we're looking at the ratio. So I haven't really spoken out too much about vegetable oils on the show, but they're linked to insulin resistance, they're linked to heart disease. It's very interesting, very compelling when you get into it. So I just kind of wanted to put a hammer on that. Now, when it comes to, I want to get to the stress piece, because like you said, that's kind of the one pulling the strings, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to figure out some very, very insightful and practical ways to reduce that. But when it comes to oxidative stress, right? So are we just eating fruits and vegetables high in antioxidants? You said you're primarily animal-based. So what are you doing other than, keeping your carbohydrates low and preventing all the free radicals anyway? Are you mitigating oxidative stress in any other way?
Yeah, so I think that providing your body with various hormetic stresses is very important, because the hormetic stress is something that is kind of a little bit of an insult to the body, but it makes it respond in a very positive way, and actually you get a net positive response of antioxidant production. My preferred way to get a hormetic stress is exercise or sunlight, or even a ketogenic diet, or just being metabolically flexible. Those are the hormetic stresses that. Cold therapy. Yeah. So like I get right out of the sauna and I go right in for a cold shower. I just go one to the other. Like, that's not only going to create a hormetic stress, it reduces oxidative stress, but it's also going to train your nervous system, so you have more balance in your autonomic nervous system, which is really important. So yeah, that's one thing I like to do. And the other thing I like to do is collagen protein. make sure that I get, because collagen is it's not very well utilized in modern diets, right? You're not people are like cutting off the bits of the steak where the connective tissue is and that kind of stuff. But even in like standard American diet, you're not going to find collagen much at all. So, but collagen is really important because it has a different array of amino acids in it that are really helpful for building the antioxidants or encouraging your liver to make the antioxidants like glutathione and superoxide dismutase that it needs to. So collagen is really important in that sense because that's really going to reduce oxidative stress. Those are my preferred ways to do it.
Beautiful. And I think the sauna you mentioned can kind of work to thin the blood, right, on its own, which I thought was really fascinating.
And if it's infrared, it's also going to energize the water in the blood, which is going to. So the other thing I didn't mention is that the lining of fourth phase water that lines the artery is also protective to the artery. So if you build that up with infrared light, infrared sauna, then it's going to help protect the artery. It's also going to help you detox because you sweat a lot, and external toxins that get into you are also a very major source of oxidative stress. So I can't speak highly enough of sauna, especially infrared sauna.
Awesome. Okay, awesome. So let's get to ways to mitigate stress. I mean, everybody, we really need this, everybody alive on planet Earth today. So what are you doing? How do you know if you're super stressed out? Are you measuring your HRV? Tell us how we identify it and what we do about it.
Yeah. So HRV is probably it's the best way we know of to measure balance in the autonomic nervous system. And I think that it's no mistake that we measure it through the heart, the heart rate variability. And what it is it's not heart rate, it's just the variability between heartbeats. The more varied they are, the more able your body is to go back and forth between stress and non-stress state. Whereas if it's not very variable, you're stuck in this midline. And if you have a stressful thing happen to you, you can't adapt to it as well. And that's a problem. That means there's imbalance in the autonomic nervous system. So heart rate variability is the best way to track it. And people always ask me, well, what's the best heart rate variability to have? And it's like, well, it's not like this one specific number you should have. Like the range, it could be anywhere from 20 to 100. It's really important to get your baseline, which you're going to have to track for a week or so to get, and then work to improve it from there, but not compare it to everybody else's. Right. So, and then as far as like improving heart rate variability and improving balance in the autonomic nervous system, there's all the things that we think about, like nature exposure and meditation and yoga and like we talked about, like hot and cold therapy, like all these things that we can do to help create balance, or even positive social relationships and things like that. But I think that it's really important that we remove the things that are causing the imbalance, which is not easy to do, because sometimes there are things that are necessary for our life. It could be our kids that stress us out. It could be our job that we are incredibly dependent on. We need that. That's how society's created. So it's not easy to do, but it's always important to have that mentality. Like, what can I eliminate rather than what can I just keep adding to try and counteract the things? Like it's like trying to, put out all the fires without catching the arson as you're starting them. It's that kind of notion. But when we think about the things that we should try and remove from our life, if we can, it's always the most important things are the things that make us feel out of control or in unpredictable situations. Because there was a study done in these big companies where they looked at all the employees at the company, and they found out they had them report their stress and the type of stress they had, and they looked at health outcomes in these people. And it was the people, so people all throughout the company, all throughout the tiers of the company, from like, the lowest employees to the highest ones, the CEO, right? They all reported stress. And they all reported stress in like major quantities, right? But it was the people who were lower on the totem pole who reported like, they didn't have, they had their job wasn't secure, or their pay wasn't reliable, or the hours were unpredictable, or something like that. Like those types of things were the most stressful for them, and they had the worst health outcomes. Whereas the CEO at the top, who had just the same amount of stress, but had control of his hours and had control of his salary and all these types of things. Like they had control, like even though they had just as much stress, the health outcome was way different. They were way healthier overall. So it's when you look into your life, if there's things that make you feel out of control, make you feel like you're in unpredictable situations often, Those are the things you want to try and eliminate if you can. That's going to have the most impact on the balancing autonomic nervous system and your stress.
Yeah, I used to have people identify their top 10 stressors that are within their control, like you said, and then we attack one every month, like troubleshoot. What can we do about this? And let's dedicate the next 30 days to figuring out a solution. Do you think there's any validity to the fact that the way that you perceive stress, like, oh my gosh, I'm stressed, my body, this is I'm gonna get a heart attack. Holy, I gotta freak out. Or wow, this is stress. It's helping me rise to the occasion. I have all these resources available to me. Do you feel like that matters, that if we
Definitely.
just change our perception of it?
Definitely. And there was a study that I talk about in the book that shows that it's just an associational study. So it can't really prove causation, but it's interesting to, when you looked at it, people who reported having lots of stress, and then they looked at, they tracked these people, and they tracked their health outcomes long-term. And obviously the people in the study, they found that people with more stress, more stressful events in their life, and more just stress overall had poorer health outcomes. But they also asked these people, do you feel like stress is bad for your health? And so when they said yes, there was a heavy correlation to high stress and poor health outcomes. But when people said no, I do not think stress creates poor health, the association went completely away, went down to 0%.
It's so beautiful. And it reminds me of my dad. He was always pushing me in sports and all the things, but the night before, I'd always get this pit in my stomach and I'd get nervous, and he'd always say, good, I like that you're nervous. It means you're going to do well tomorrow. Like your body's going to get ready and you're going to perform your best. And I remember that he planted that idea in my head, and hopefully that will help some of you too. Okay. Dr. Hussey, this has been amazing. Tell us where to connect with you and where we can get your free gift and your book.
So my website is resourceyourhealth.com. And my books are there. My blog is there. My health coaching is on that website. But I'm also on social media, on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, just Dr. Stephen Hussey. And then on my webpage, the homepage, I have a kind of a gift for people that I give out. It's an analysis of like plant fat versus animal fat, because there's unsaturated and saturated that people talk about all the time. And there's different categories. There's omega-6 versus omega-3, that kind of stuff. But there's also this category of fat that's plant fat versus animal fat. That's cholesterol versus phytosterol. And so I talk about the 5 top studies about those and give my opinion on that. So people can download that right from my website, from the homepage there. I think that's pretty good. And the book is available in multiple places. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble. It's on the Chelsea Green website, which is the publisher. So people can find those at many different places.
Yeah. And I highly encourage you to check out, the plant versus animal fat. That sounds fascinating. I'm going to do that immediately, but also his book, because while you understand these concepts with a depth, I don't think many people do. It's presented in a way that's really digestible. It starts with a story. Every chapter I read had a little kind of personal anecdote, and then it went into a little bit of sciencey stuff, but it was always very, very well presented, and just something that I think anybody could benefit from. And I'm so glad that you released it, because you might not be a cardiologist, but this is a deeply personal issue. And I often find that you've probably done more research than a lot of cardiologists out there. So thank you, Dr. Hussey. It's been an honor. And go check out the book, check out his download. And if you write another one, we'll have you back. Okay.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Okay.